welcome again. Today we are going to discuss a beautiful process by which this ugly face finally turns into a lovely, beautiful, small face. And this is the development of the face itself and the cavities within. Let's start with recapitulation, as always needed, always required for you. The first semester stuff is to be handled safely. The picture should be familiar to you. The sagittal cuts of different stages of the embryonic life. At the beginning of the cephalocaudal folding, only cephalocaudal folding is picked up on these pictures. And this is almost the end of the folding. One can recognize, hopefully, the grayish ectoderm. Underneath of it is the red, representing the endoderm, and in between them the blue is the mesoderm. As you remember, I cannot ask you, so I should give the clue to you. As you remember, there were two places, both at the anterior and the caudal part of the body, where there is no intervening mesoderm in between the ecto and endodermal layers. The one in front is the precaudal plate, at least at the beginning of the folding, it is called precaudal plate, and at the end, because it gets deep into depression, this is called a primitive oral cavity, the stomodon. Therefore, at this stage, the name changes into bucopharyngeal membrane. I think it makes sense. Between the bucca, the cheek, and the pharynx, the membrane makes the closure. At the caudal end, this is not needed for us, of course, today. At the caudal end, the same place is found where, without mesoderm, ecto and endoderm makes a double layer of epithelial tissue, and that is the cloacal membrane. And because both germ layers, ecto and endoderm, as well as mesoderm, so all the three initially is made up of epithelial tissue. Therefore, without mesoderm, two epithelial plates fuse with each other, and because from mesoderm blood vessels can develop, this is the reason why at these places, two places of the body, there is not enough nutrition of the epithelium, so the fate is determined. It should soon, in both cases, should disappear, should rupture. Other things are indicated by question marks. The primitive oral cavity, I have already mentioned the name of that, is the stomodon. And here the process of the yolk sac is the allantois before the endoderm gets trapped into the folded body. The sequences of happenings are seen here just to indicate the final degree of the turns of these membranes with the cephalocaudal folding. 270 degrees the precaudal plate turns to become the bucopharyngeal membrane, and less than 180 degrees the cloacal membrane makes the turn. If you imagine that according to the direction of this arrow, you would look into the developing oral cavity of the embryo, then that would be the situation, that would be the drawing of this stage. I should tell the truth that something like 35 years ago I've made this drawing just to make a semi-animation of the pictures, because I always love to see things happening after each other in the same place. So what I made, a transparent foil, I made the drawings, and I try to shift one on top of the other and remove the previous one to make a kind of animation, far not animation. I kept these drawings because I think that these are useful, as well as I may make animation much easier with the computer now. So what you can recognize here, the stomodon is surrounded by 5 different growing tissues. This one is the frontal nasal prominence. This is unpaired, and there are 2 paired prominences, the maxillary and the mandibular prominences on the sides. Because this one is before the 26th day of development, therefore one can recognize the still open anterior neuropore. The maxillary and mandibular prominences are the anterior split ends of swellings found on the neck region, face and neck region of the embryo in this early stage, resembling fairly well to the gills of a shark, you can see here. So some curved semicircular elevations are found, 4, 6 in numbers, and these are the branchial arches or pharyngeal arches. The anterior branchial arch or pharyngeal arch anteriorly splits into two, and that's how the maxillary and mandibular prominences can go separately anteriorly. So with the fast growth, the stomodon finally gets deeper and deeper and deeper. It's worth to emphasize what we did before related to the development of the teeth. The mesenchyme found within this first pharyngeal arch, also called mandibular arch, mesenchyme has got a neural crest origin. So neural crest cells migrate into the first pharyngeal arch and turn into connective tissue into mesenchyme. That's why we use the ectomesenchyme term for that. Someone can recognize the second pharyngeal arch below the first one started to grow and started to swell. Half a week later, what you can recognize is that the stomodon gets deeper and deeper, as well as, due to the reason we mentioned before, the bucopharyngeal membrane ruptures and gradually disappears, making connection between the primitive oral cavity and the pharyngeal gut, the beginning of the gut system. The very important happening at this stage that some thickening of the ectoderm appear on the frontonasal prominence on both sides, and these are the ones which later become the sensory epithelium of the olfactory region of the nasal cavity, so responsible for smelling. These cells become, these are the nasal pits. The nasal placode, the thickening, is part of the placode ectoderm. Again, it's worth to revise very briefly the parts of the placode. That is my personal experience, that people have trouble mostly on the exam with this question. If they pick up the placode ectoderm, you must remember that ectoderm is divided into surface ectoderm, neural crest, as well as the placode. So placode has got equally important role in the development. The placode is a horseshoe-like thickening of the ectoderm on top of the primitive brain vesicles, so the cranial part of the closing neural tube. You can see the neural tube here, and the anterior neuropore still open. Other things should also be revised if you get time for that. Different parts of the intraembryo mesoderm, for example, but now we should concentrate to the horseshoe-like thickening of the ectoderm, the placode. And the different parts of the placode give different final organs or tissues. The thing what helped me to memorize which part becomes what final organ later, then imagining this horseshoe on top of the head, and using your finger, you press different parts deep into your face, you can easily end up with the solution. In the midline, there is a single part of the placode, so the midline structure should develop, and if you imagine your finger going deep into your oral cavity and further up through the sphenoid bone, and the body of the sphenoid on top of it, you remember the depression occupied by the pituitary gland, then you can memorize that this one is the hypophyseal placode. Pituitary gland is the hypophysis in other words, in Greek, and that is hypophyseal placode. Next to this double depression by two fingers, if you press deep, then you can reach the top of each half of the nasal cavity, and that's how to memorize that this one is the one which turns into the sensory epithelium of the nasal cavity. This is the nasal placode. This is the thing what we need now. And if further lateral, if you press, then you can get into the orbit. And here the lens of the eye develops from the placode. Still more laterally, if you press your finger deep enough to reach the tip of the pyramid, on the anterior surface of tip of the pyramid, you've learned a depression. This shallow depression was a trigeminal impression. And that's how to memorize that. This is the part of the placode which gives rise to the sensory cells of the trigeminal ganglion. Therefore, trigeminal placode is the name. Further lateral, if you press your finger then into the body of the pyramid, you can get where the inner ear is located, and that's how to memorize that otic placode is the one which in the inner ear becomes sensory epithelium. Then the rest of the placode, further caudal, splits into two, so therefore we distinguish a dorsal epibranchial placode and the ventral epibranchial placode. The ventral one, cells of it migrate into the tongue and give rise to taste buds of the tongue, and the dorsal epibranchial placode gives other ganglia. So in addition to the trigeminal ganglion, the ganglia of the fascia, the glossopharyngeal and the vagus nerves are of placodal origin from the dorsal epibranchial placode. So that was their vision, repetition of things. At the 5th weeks, you can see that the nasal placode gradually gets depressed, as well as the other part of the placode appears on the surface of the face, but fairly laterally located are the lens placodes. Therefore, at this stage, the embryo resembles to this beautiful bird, the snipe, having the two eyes facing laterally. So the nasal placode deepens, the placode itself moves back deep into mesenchyme, and this shallow deepening now is called the nasal pit. And by this developmental happening, the frontonasal prominence should be divided into 3 parts. The middle portion is called the medial frontal process, surrounded by the 2 lateral frontal processes. Somewhat later, 3 days later, the nasal pit further deepens and gives nasal sac posteriorly. And this nasal, the small opening leading into the nasal sac gets surrounded by 2 outgrowing parts of the lateral frontal process. The medial nasal prominence, which was previously called globular process, quite nicely referring to the shape of it, and the lateral nasal prominence. What you can see here that the mandibular prominences have already fused to make the lower jaw and the skin and mucous membrane of it. The eye is still laterally oriented, and there is a groove formed by the fusion between the lateral nasal process and the maxillary process on each side, and this groove connects the oral cavity with the eye. This is the nasolacrimal groove. Deep inside the nasolacrimal groove there is a cord of epithelial cells trapped within the mesenchyme. Later I should get back to this point. As well as you can see the first pharyngeal cleft in between the first pharyngeal and the second pharyngeal arch, because the second pharyngeal arch mostly gives rise inside of the mesenchyme, develops the hyoid bone. Therefore, this one is the hyomandibular cleft. The second pharyngeal arch is the hyoid arch. Just to remind you that we already mentioned the nerve belonging to the first and second, even the third pharyngeal arch is the nerve of the first branchial nerve was the mandibular or trigeminal nerve altogether, and the second was the facial belonging to the hyoid arch of the neck. What happened now, 1.5 weeks later, the eyes have shifted, moved to the front, so fairly good looking head you can see now. The lower jaw have completely fused, and the first pharyngeal cleft gets surrounded by outgrowing, protruding parts of the mesenchyme, protruding the ectoderm of course, and these are the auricular hillocks which surround the external acoustic meatus finally. So that appeared here, but at a quite interesting position. The developing ear is. The globular process have fused with the lateral nasal process, so now there is only a small opening leading into the deepened sac, the nasal sac, and this is the final rostral. What you've learned, perhaps you are going to learn in macroscopy soon. The medial frontal process has got a small ridge, transversely oriented ridge, quite low within the process, and this one is called the nasal fold. The nasal fold separates two parts of the medial nasal process, an upper part which is called the triangular area, and the lower part which is called the infranasal area. Someone can easily figure out that the triangular area gives rise to the back of the nose, as well as the lower part of the nasal septum is the one which develops from the infranasal area between the two nostrils. The hyoid bone has already started to be formed, and from the second pharyngeal arch, and the third and fourth starts to form the laryngeal cartilages. So these are the additional things appearing here. Now this one is quite a good looking guy. The only problem with him is that at the angle of the mandible, somewhere here, the ear is, which of course with further shift should move backward gradually and upward, changing its position, as well as the extremely large neurocranium could be a bit strange, but at this stage the facial cranium is much smaller in proportion related to the neurocranium. Later it will change, of course. Everything has already been formed otherwise. At the nasolacrimal groove, deep within the groove, there is the cord of the epithelial tissue, what I mentioned before, and again a cord of epithelium. The fate of it has already been determined, because epithelium has no blood supply, only diffusion supplies the epithelial cells. Therefore the central cell mass should die, and by dying a tube is formed, and this is the reason. This applies to many developmental happening of the lung, for example, or glands or anything. So this duct trapped deep here is the future nasal lacrimal duct connecting the orbit with the nasal cavity. The medial the globular processes, medial nasal processes make the middle portion of the upper lip. So good to look over the components of the upper lip, not only the medial nasal processes, but the maxillary prominences are needed, and therefore by the fusion of the three portions, two places occur where developmental disorders can be produced. You know that making it simple, the malformations are happening there where something was to disappear and it failed to disappear, or something was to fuse and failed to fuse. Here this failure of fusion can result in malformations. Here is the animation what I made. I don't know who prefers that, but I did. So when step by step you can follow the happenings on the same illustration. That was of great help to me 35 years ago and still. So this is the final looking of this little bit turicephal individual. At the lateral view, perhaps not much we can add. The same things you can see with the same color codes. This one is the frontonasal prominence, the blue is the maxillary, green is the mandibular prominence. These are the two anterior edges of the first pharyngeal arch, as we mentioned before, and the primordia of the next pharyngeal arches are also recognizable. Here is the lens placode, here is the nasal pit developing in the frontonasal prominence, dividing into medial and lateral frontal prominences. And as the development grows with the extreme growth of the brain vesicles, therefore bending happens on the head. So the eyes gradually should move to front, and the ear, the auricular hillox gradually to back. And finally this one is a good looking guy with a closed nasolacrimal duct in the depth of nasolacrimal sulcus, and the upper and lower lips already ready. And here is the animation, which hopefully helps, but not necessarily for everyone. And now here is the wonder. This one is a real picture, not just, but in embryology mostly illustrations or drawings are required. This one is a nice scanning electron microscopic preparation of not a cow. This one is not the nose of a cow, but this one is a developing embryo at the 7th week. Here you can recognize the inlet of the stomodum, so almost completely the rima oris is formed. The two mandibular prominences have fused to form the lower jaw, and here are the two nostrils surrounded by the medial and lateral nasal processes, already fused with each other, and the nostrils are really just small inlets into the half of the nasal cavity. Here you can recognize a nasal fold, triangular area and infranasal area, and somewhere here you can expect the nasal lacrimal sulcus to be present, or groove or cleft to be present, as well as the second pharyngeal arch, partly broken, because this one is a freeze fracture preparation. Then the cavity, so that's how the face is already formed, and now the cavities accommodated within the face are to be discussed. One of them is the nasal cavity. This drawing is a schematic illustration of sagittal cut through one of the nostrils, doesn't matter left or right nostril, with a nasal pit which deepens into the nasal sac. This is already nasal sac even more deep, and finally this primitive nasal cavity gets separated by a tiny membrane from the stomodum itself, and that one is called the oronasal membrane, which soon disappears, and therefore finally there is a common oronasal cavity formed, and that is need to be separated into two halves of nasal cavity and one oral cavity below. You can recognize also that this thickening, this one was originally in the surface, that is a nasal placode. When it gets pressed deep posteriorly and up, finally is found at the roof of the nasal cavity, which corresponds to the olfactory region or olfactory area of the nasal cavity. That's why we said that the nasal placode gives rise to sensory epithelial cells of the nose. If in frontal cut you imagine this drawing made, again 35 years ago, the same color codes are applied. This one is frontonasal prominence, two maxillary prominences, and the mandibular prominence down. As well as you can see something from the inner aspect of the frontonasal prominence growing down in the mid-sagittal plane, as well as you can see something protruding up into the stomodum from the floor, and this one is the developing tongue. So the nasal septum starts to grow down. The inner aspect of the maxillary prominences again have got outgrowing swellings, which are the palatine shelves, but contrary to the position of the definite palate, the shelves initially start to grow down, almost sagittally down, because of the tongue. The tongue is in between. If you follow the processes, bigger the nasal septum becomes, and because tongue moved down, therefore the shelves had the chance to turn into horizontal. Finally, the three processes approach each other and fuse with each other, and therefore there is no more communication between the nasal halves of the nasal cavity and the oral cavity. The separation is over, and this is the definite palate, contrary to the primitive oronasal membrane, which was a primary palate. If someone loves the sequential drawings, the same steps on A, B, C, D, E, F drawings you can follow. So of course everyone needs different way of memorization, different way of studying. Maybe this is more helpful for someone. Now just get rid of purely the drawings and illustrations. Beautiful pictures was taken from the collection of University of Southern California, showing the different developmental steps. one can recognize palatine shelves protruding from the sides of the stomodon into the stomodon. Primarily, the growth is oriented downwards on both sides of the primordium of the tongue, which more and more protrudes into the stomodon, because the gradual elongation of the face, the tongue relatively changes its position and moves down, and therefore the palatine shelves can take this horizontal position and can have the chance to fuse with each other, and that is the thing what is seen here. Some important things are to be recognized, like the primordia of the teeth, what we discussed previously in detail, as well as one can recognize beautiful hyaline cartilage, which is the core mesenchyme of the first pharyngeal arch, and this one is called the Meckel's cartilage, giving rise to several things, amongst which the mandible is important, which ossifies around this cartilage. Therefore, this is the mandibular arch as well. The other name of the first pharyngeal arch is mandibular arch. Also, here was some sign of cartilage formation here. This one is not a very sad dog, but this one is a stage of the development of the palate, with the two swellings, the palatine shelves and the nasal septum, the last going down and the shelves going towards each other. A little bit later, important thing happened here. The cartilage of the nasal septum appears, pure beautiful hyaline cartilage, as well as you can recognize, I hope you do, the ossification started to go on the sides of the growing septum, nasal septum. This one is of desmal type, so this one is desmal or intermembranous bone formation, how the palatine shelves and the palates develop. If you sit on top of the tongue and you would look up into the primitive nasal cavity, that's what would you see. Frontonasal prominence surrounded by the two maxillary prominences. Gradually the fusion happens. First the medial and lateral nasal processes to form the nostril, and then the septum appears growing downward towards the palatine shelves, and finally the three fuse with each other to form the definite palate. Now, to prove that this one is a different, this part of the palate, as well as the alveolar process and the lip, has got different source of origin. One proof is the innervation of the mucous membrane of the palate, for example. Fairly well you remember the position of the incisive foramen, which is now covered by the incisive papilla, if you remember. Through this foramen, nerve comes to innervate this anterior part of the palate. This nerve is the incisive nerve, the same as the foramen has got, the same name. And this segment or part has got three different components, as I mentioned before, the labial, the alveolar, and the palatal components. So these are innervated by the same nerve. The nerve comes from the nasal cavity. The nasal cavity is posterior and down, innervated by the posterior nasal branches from the maxillary nerve, and the longest of these branches is called the nasopalatine nerve, and when it reaches the incisive foramen and reaches the oral cavity, the name of this end branch is the incisive nerve. The rest of the palate is innervated by the greater and lesser palatine nerves. I hope you remember the greater and lesser palatine foramina at the posterior part of the hard palate. And these palatine nerves are also branches of maxillary, so altogether the first pharyngeal nerve or branchial nerve is responsible for innervation. Again, sequential illustration of the happenings 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, if you prefer that. So unfortunately, not always goes everything well, and this is when malformations happen. The most frequent of them is cleft lip, jaw, and palate, with combination or only simple form of these cleft structures. Here you can see first one schematic illustration of the cleft lip when only the labium, the lip, is remains separated into two parts. This unilateral, of course, unilateral cleft lip, called kailoschisis in Greek. And if the alveolar process is involved, then this one is the cleft jaw, and this is called a gnatoschisis. And if the problem further extends back and involves the palate as well, this one is called, if it's single only, then cleft palate. If all the things, like in the last illustration, all the things are combined with each other, then you should combine the name. Kailo-gnato-palatoschisis is the name of this. This is quite frightening at first glance, but very nice results could be reached. Not only on one side, but bilaterally. These malformations may happen. Then, of course, bilateral cleft lip, jaw, palate is the name of the disease. Mostly genetic disorders are responsible for the formation, but not only that, environmentals, amongst which this was quite frequent when an epileptic pregnant lady takes anticonvulsant pills, like phenobarbital diphenhydramine, then many times more frequently the babies can have this problem of development after birth. And this very dangerous viral infection also could be responsible for some of the malformations. This is the rubella. This is so much dangerous, and if it is proven that the lady had infection with rubella, this is an absolute indication of abortion. The guys should not be so much proud, because the age of the father is also a factor. More old the father is, the more frequently this malformation may happen. So even if the appearance is frightening, if operation is made in time, then quite beautiful result could be reached. Here you can see cleft palate reconstruction before operation, after operation, almost nothing is visible, so very nice result is reached by operation, but it needs a very careful planning before making the operation, not to deform the face of the baby. So computer modeling is made, 3D CT images are required, and making the careful calculations and measurements. Finally they can determine, they can tell how much tissue is needed here for the proper reconstruction. Here you can see some beautiful examples for very successful operations before and after operation, so almost nothing is recognizable very nicely. The disease could be cured. Another malformation, there is chance to be formed here when fusion failed to happen, like in the previous, but fusion of the lateral nasal process with the maxillary prominences, so at the place of the nasolacrimal groove. If there is failure of fusion, then not even duct is formed, therefore just a wet stripe connects the eye with the upper part of the lip, and this one is called the oblique facial cleft. The other is the median facial cleft, which is at first quite strange, because this middle portion of the lip has got a single origin, single process, so there is no fusion needed here. But if there is midline dysplasia, so due mostly to the SHH gene problem, then there could be a slit in between the two halves of the lips, and this is a median facial cleft, which again could be cured very successfully, as you can see on this picture. Even more severe appearance you can see here with beautiful postoperative result. Another malformation is the ocular hypertelorism. It means that the eyes are far separated from each other, wide set eyes, when the interorbital distance exceeds 2 centimeters. Then again this needs operation, but this is much more severe operation. All the skin from the forehead has been reflected down, then orbital parts together with the nasal of the frontal bone are taken out, and the resection is made, so piece of the midline bone has been eliminated, removed, and only the rest of the frontal bone is put back to the position, skin pulled back like normal, and here is the final result, and I think it's quite definite. Also some examples before and after the operation, and again I think that is quite acceptable related to the pre-operative stage. This one is quite fairly nice lady. I think that was it briefly, and thanks for your attention.